All right, it's that time of year again. It's time for the annual year-end Ring IQ Awards, where we recap some of the most memorable moments of this past year. We're going to kick it off with this year's biggest goof. In the women's category, I think the biggest goof I saw this entire year. The worthiest recipient for this award has to be Australia's own Shotgun, Shannon O'Connell. Shannon O'Connell, who this year finally got to share the ring with her domestic rival, IBF bantamweight champion Ebony Bridges. Ebony Bridges, who Shannon O'Connell spent a very long time, belittling and berating, calling her anything from a skanky stripper, saying she's not worthy to be her sparring partner, only so that when she actually shares the ring with her, well, you saw what happened. You know, trash talk is a part of the sport. It's an occupational hazard. Comes with the territory, and I get that, but you can't spend that much time talking down somebody, and you gotta back it up. You can talk trash, but you've gotta back it up, and that's the exact opposite of what Shannon O'Connell did. She talked a good one, and it sounded good to some people, not me. I picked Ebony to win. Better still, Shannon O'Connell is this year's recipient for biggest goof in the year of 2022. In the men's category, the single biggest goof by way of a man this year in the sport of boxing, that award has to go to Anthony Joshua. It has to. For his post-fight antics after losing to Alexander Usyk for the second time. He threw his toys out the pram, threw the belts out the ring. Had a full-on tantrum. A very emotional moment for the former unified champion who could not get his emotions in check. And it was just a poor display. It was cringeworthy. It was this year's biggest goof. In the men's category, it was. And that takes care of the one category nobody aspires to win an award in. We then move on to the most improved category, the most improved female fighter of the year. A few names came to mind for this one. One among them was Stevie Levy, though the fighter that I think has exhibited the most improvement in the last 12 months has to be Kirsty Bavington. Kirsty Bavington, who in 2019 dropped a decision to Sherelle Brown. Last year, she was decisioned by Sandy Ryan, but this year, she was able to turn it all around. Since having dropped that decision to Sandy Ryan last year, she has collected the scalps of both unbeaten April Hunter and unbeaten Naomi Mans. She is the welterweight division's current reigning EBU champion on a 4-fight winning streak. She is establishing herself as a somebody after getting off to a somewhat rocky start earlier in her career. Kirsty Bavington is this year's most improved fighter. In the women's category. In the men's category, it's got to be Joe Joyce. It's got to be smoking Joe Joyce, who still has an unblemished record, but this was a guy you used to wonder about. He didn't look anything special opposite the ring, Bryant Jennings or Carlos Takam. He had a lot of right hands in that Jennings fight. More recently, he had a lot of right hands in that Christian Hammer fight. Looked slow and sluggish. Didn't look anything special in those fights, but it was that Joseph Parker fight, his last fight, that really put him on the map and really showed that he's shown improvement opposite the ring. Former WBO heavyweight champion Joseph Parker, he showed that he belongs, and he is this year's recipient in the men's category for most improved fighter of the year. We then move on to the next category, prospect of the year. Women's prospect of the year in the year of 2022 has to be Carolyn Dubois. Carolyn Dubois. I had to take my time with this decision as there was a lot to choose from, and there still is. You know, you got anybody from Beatrice Ferreira to Raven Chapman to Sky Nicholson to Kara Sardingstall to Lauren Price. There are a lot of really good girls coming through, really good prospects, but Carolyn Dubois just nicks it on both performance and activity. She's been busy and consistent. Points for style as well. She looks every inch a monster. One of the highest ceilings of any unbeaten up-and-comer coming through. Campaigning in the lightweight division, it's conceivable that she may see herself one day become a lightweight champion, a super lightweight champion, maybe even a welterweight champion. She's got the youth. She's got the ability. She is Ring IQ's 2022 prospect of the year. It was also very nip and tuck in the men's category. So many good guys, so many good unbeaten up-and-comers, so many good prospects this year. Who stood out? Jared Anderson. Jared Anderson's performance over Jerry Forrest That stood out to me. A lot of the prospects saw action, a lot of the young guys, the unbeaten up-and-comers. But what Jared Anderson was able to do to Jerry Forrest, a seasoned veteran, a guy who gave Zile Zhang a lot of problems, made him go through the gears, a guy who gave Michael Hunter a lot of problems, made him go through the gears. In their rematch, he didn't give Jared Anderson any problems. Jared completely overwhelmed him, outclassed him, 13-0 with 13 KOs. This kid's the goods.
Now listen, if you want to go with Shushu Carrington or you want to go with Zayas or Fernando Vargas' kid, I get it. But this performance from Jared, it really stood out to me. It really left an impression. He finished that guy in, what was it, 2 rounds?
Jerry Forrest is no squirrely amateur. Jared Anderson looking as good as he did opposite the ring that guy when some other guys can't. That's really saying something. Jared Anderson is this year's prospect of the year.
In the men's category,
we then move on to Performance of the Year. Not to be confused with Fight of the Year. Performance of the Year doesn't necessarily carry all the ebbs and flows of a Fight of the Year candidate. No, Performance of the Year boils down to the individual and what an individual fighter exhibited in a contest. In the women's category, Performance of the Year has to go to none other than the blonde bomber Ebony.
for the longest time, this is a fighter that has been fighting for respect.
Fighting to be taken seriously as a pugilist, as a prize fighter. Even after the show that she put on opposite the ring, Shannon Courtenay, there were people they didn't want to give her just due. Even after she saw herself become a champion opposite the ring, long reigning champion of Argentina, Maria Cecilia Roman, there were still naysayers. There were still doubters, and they poured all their hopes into Ebony's countrywoman, Shannon O'Connell, just for Ebony to completely dominate her. Surviving an early scare, knocked off balance by a hard shot, Ebony Bridges rallied back and showed that she can deal with adversity. She can seal the deal opposite the ring. A fighter who had a whole lot to say leading up to the fight, though not a lot to do during the fight. Ebony Bridges is this year's recipient for Performance of the Year in the women's category. In the men's category, that award has to go to Japan's own Kenshiro Teraji for his performance in the unification match opposite his countryman and then unbeaten champion Hiroto Kayaguchi, who I thought was going to win that fight. At minimum, I thought he'd give Kenshiro hell, and it was the exact opposite.
And he, like Ebony Bridges, did suffer a scare throughout the course of the match, though for the most part, he completely dominated his quarry, completely dominated the man opposite the ring, stopped him in about 7 rounds.
He is now the light flyweight division's Ring Magazine, WBA, and WBC champion, doing so in style.
This year's recipient in the men's category for Performance
of the Year. We then move on to our next category, Breakout Star of the Year. Not to be confused with Fighter of the Year.
There are some other aspects that go into Fighter of the Year that don't necessarily go into this category.
This category accents notoriety more than anything else. A fighter that achieved substantial notoriety in the last 12 months in the women's category.
It's Alicia Baumgartner,
which in effect makes Alicia a 2-time recipient of this award here on Ring IQ. She won it last year for knocking out Terry Harper in a fight she wasn't favored to win. She's winning it this year
for similar reasons. She wasn't favored by the bookies to beat Michaela Mayer in their grudge match, their super featherweight unification bout, but that's what she did. She eked it out. She won a decision, and now she's all anybody's talking about, for better or worse.
Whether it's because they want to see her run it back with Michaela Mayer or because they're supporting her undisputed run set to go down next year on the undercard of Serrano versus Cruz.
Alicia Baumgartner continues to make waves from 2021 into 2022, and she is this year's Breakout Star of the Year in the women's category. In the men's category,
it's got to be Japan's own undisputed bantamweight champion, Naoya Inoue. Naoya Inoue, who was favored to beat Nonito Donaire in their rematch earlier this year, and he was heavily favored to beat Paul Butler in their undisputed title fight just a few weeks ago.
But it's not so much about the dominance that he's exhibiting, so much as the attention that he's bringing to this weight class. You know, the bantamweight division, at least not in America, it's not a division that normally gets this much attention. Moreover, there aren't that many fighters in the Japanese boxing scene that get the attention that Naoya Inoue is getting.
Neither Kenshiro Taraji or Hiroto Kayaguchi have been getting it. Long-reigning 4-division champion Kazuto Ioka, he hasn't been getting it.
Ryota Murata, one of Japan's biggest and brightest stars, one of their former Olympians. He had a lot of notoriety in Japan, not so much in America. That's what sets Naoya Inoue apart.
What makes him the recipient of this award, unifying his division in the fashion that he did, whilst garnering this level of notoriety. He's getting notoriety in the West!
He's this year's recipient in the men's category for Male Breakout Star of the Year.
We had a few pretty noteworthy rivalries in the sport of boxing this year. In the women's category, we had the long-awaited, long-anticipated Shields versus Marshall fight, the Australian grudge match between Ebony Bridges and Shannon O'Connell, though no other rivalry this year quite captivated the audience's attention more than Baumgartner versus Mayer. That's right. That's why people are still asking for a second fight, still asking for a rematch, because that's how good, that's how titillating.
That rivalry is the stuff of legends. Two fighters, two high-level fighters, two champions, to where it's not just about belts, it's about bragging rights. They jointly.
Because it takes two to tango. It takes two fighters to make a great rivalry, two great fighters. And both Michaela Mayer and Alicia Baumgartner are the recipients of this year's Rivalry of the Year award in the women's category. In the men's category, we saw a few rivalries this year as well.
We finally saw Tyson Fury and Dillian White share the ring with each other. They've had a few words for each other over the years, though the rivalry in the build-up, it didn't live up to the hype. The fight itself,
not that memorable. We saw the long-awaited, long-anticipated trilogy between Canelo Alvarez and Gennady Golovkin, and while Canelo had a lot of fiery stuff to say, a lot of vitriol for his old buddy Gennady Golovkin, the fight itself was somewhat anticlimactic.
Quite a few rivalries this year, some more memorable than others, though.
The recipients of this year's Rivalry of the Year award in the men's category, they've got to be Amir Khan and Kell Brook. Did you guys forget that was this year? Earlier this year, in February.
The build-up was certainly entertaining, even if the fight itself was one-sided. To finally see those two guys share the ring with each other, after all these years, wondering if the fight would ever happen.
And the one-sided beating that Amir Khan suffered at the hands of Kell Brook, who finally got to get his hands on that guy, that they finally settled it. Khan versus Brook takes the cake for Rivalry of the Year in the men's category. We then come to Trainer of the Year. In the women's category, this was a bit chippy, a bit nip and tuck. Hard to make a decision, as there were quite a few fighters out there that had memorable moments this year. But in the women's category,
Trainer of the Year has to go to Joe Gallagher, Tesco Joe.
Here's why. He's been with Miss Great Britain. He's been with Natasha Jonas as long as I can remember. He's the one who got her back in the winner's bracket after that shock upset loss to Vivian Obanov. He's the one who was there with her in that signature fight she had with Terry Harper. And he's the one who's still with her now, that she's a unified Ring Magazine and lineal junior middleweight champion. Tesco Joe doesn't get enough credit for the good work he's done alongside Natasha Jonas. And he is this year's recipient for Trainer of the Year in the women's category. In the men's category, that award must go to Derek James. Derek James's boys have been having a great year for the most part.
Unbeaten up-and-comer Frank Martin is coming off a dominant win over Michelle Rivera. Errol Spence Jr. unified titles with Yordenis Ugas, and Jermel Charlo became the junior middleweight division's undisputed champion.
Derek's stable of fighters, the stable as a whole, has been having a great year, and I think Derek James, he has a lot to do with that. He is this year's recipient in the men's category for Trainer of the Year.
And now on to our next category. This year's biggest upsets, the ones that we just didn't see coming.
I have to say, in the sport of women's boxing, in the women's category, no upset this year quite got my attention than Mary Spencer's shock upset loss at the hands of former champion Femke Hermans. I mean, I was convinced that Mary was going to splatter this woman, and it was the exact opposite. Mary got outclassed.
You want to talk about shock upset losses? I was shocked that Mary lost that fight. That's this year's winner for biggest upset in the sport of women's boxing. In the sport of men's boxing, a more obvious candidate, a more obvious choice. Canelo Alvarez's shock upset loss to Dimitri Bivol that really wasn't a shock to me, but it did seem to shock everyone else.
I told you guys here on the channel that the guy I thought was the biggest potential banana skin out of all these guys that won a Canelo Alvarez fight, Demetrius Andrade and Jermall Charlo, David Benavidez, all these guys. Dimitri Bivol, in my eyes, was the biggest potential banana skin, and that assertion ended up playing out. Dimitri Bivol thoroughly beat Canelo Alvarez.
And before any of you guys out there want to play Monday morning quarterback, what makes it a big upset is that the bookies had Canelo Alvarez the favorite.
Irrespective of what you claim you told your buddy the day before the fight or whatever it was.
It was, in fact, an upset. Canelo Alvarez was the betting favorite going into that thing, and I myself was actually surprised how many people were writing off Dimitri Bivol's chances. Dimitri Bivol, with that one fight, put the entire boxing world on notice. He's nobody's patsy. He's no pushover.
Canelo versus Bivol is this year's recipient for biggest upset of the year in the men's category.
Then move on to knockout of the year. Some very good knockouts. I mean, some really eye-catching stuff this year.
Somewhat difficult to make a decision when it comes to this category because knockouts, generally speaking, it all boils down to preference. It really does all boil down to what you like in tandem with intangibles like the size and scale of the match and what may or may not have been on the line. Some knockouts,
they're just satisfying because of how clean they are.
There have been some pretty good knockouts in the sport of women's boxing this year, though. The award for knockout of the year, that has to go to Argentina's own unbeaten up-and-comer in the women's super bantamweight division, Nazarena Romero, and her knockout, her violent knockout of Paola Ibarra.
She cleaned her fucking clock.
Up until that point, Paola Ibarra had never been stopped. She'd suffered a couple of losses, lost a couple of decisions, but she'd never been floored like that.
In the first round of what was scheduled to be an 8-rounder, an 8-round contest, in the very first round, Nazarena Romero decided she wanted to go home early.
That's exactly what she did, stopping Paola Ibarra for the very first time in her career. Nazarena Romero, a knockout puncher, one of the more violent punchers in today's super bantamweight division, this year's recipient
for knockout of the year in the women's category. In the men's category,
so many great knockouts this year. There's almost no wrong answer, but I decided to go with Caleb Plant's clean KO in the 9th round over his old buddy, Anthony Durrell.
It could have just as easily been Wilder's clean KO over Robert Helenius or Chris Billum-Smith's last KO.
Could have been Tyson Fury's knockout win over his old buddy Dillian White.
But it was the tidiness of this knockout that really did it for me. Left hook to the body, left hook to the head.
Spiteful. Not even David Benavidez stopped Anthony Durrell in the same violent fashion that Caleb Plant did. I mean, he really sat this guy on his back pocket.
It was a clean KO, a clean knockout.
And there was a bit of backstory there, a bit of a rivalry in play. You know, Anthony Durrell, he claimed he wanted to get this guy in the ring for the longest time, and when he finally did, this was the end result.
It's nip and tuck. It's interchangeable. But my recipient for knockout of the year has to be Caleb Plant's knockout win, his 9th round knockout over Anthony Durrell.
We then come to one of the more popular categories that many of you may feel divided about. This year's fight of the year.
It's hard to gauge at the individual level how satisfied any one individual may have been with any one particular fight.
And why? But a fight that I think delivered more so than most other fights, if not all other fights that took place this year in either the women's category or the men's. A fight that had ebbs and flows and build-up and drama.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
Guts. In the women's category, the award for fight of the year has to go to Taylor versus Saraya. That fight was years in the making, and they worked on it for the longest time. And when they finally got it over the line, in front of well over 19,000 people, Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano left it all on the line.
They let it all hang out at a historic venue in front of a packed crowd.
Madison Square Garden. Those two women made history, and they delivered for the fans. They delivered for their compatriots and for themselves, for their own legacies. There were no losers in that fight.
Taylor versus Serrano edged out Shields versus Marshall for me because nobody really got hurt in Shields versus Marshall, which was still a great fight, a great action fight, but not quite as dramatic as when Amanda Serrano had Katie Taylor visibly hurt, and you saw round by round Katie Taylor was getting back in that fight.
Championship stuff, the kind of stuff you make movies about. A fight to remember. Taylor versus Serrano was this year's Fight of the Year candidate in the women's category. In the men's category,
Wood versus Conlon. My mind hasn't changed. It's Wood versus Conlon.
Lee Wood, who got sat on his back pocket early, got off to a bad start and battled his way back into this thing. Not only beating Mick Conlon, but knocking him out of the ring in dramatic fashion.
And that's the one thing that was missing in the Taylor versus Serrano fight. Nobody got knocked out, but in this fight,
not only did the guy get knocked out, he got knocked out the fucking ring.
Ebbs and flows, back and forth, the turning of the tide and how things changed throughout the course of the fight. That's what makes both Taylor and Serrano and Wood and Conlon this year's Fight of the Year recipients. Congratulations to them.
Now move on to the final category. One of the more popular categories when it comes to these kinds of awards. This year's Fighter of the Year.
I saw some people give it to Katie Taylor for beating Amanda Serrano. I saw some people give it to Clarissa Shields for beating Savannah Marshall.
But those two, they get accolades all the time. They got storied careers. This year, the fighter that I think is most deserving for Fighter of the Year as an award in the women's category, it's gotta be Natasha Jonas. It's gotta be. Who would have thought that the same Natasha Jonas, who suffered a shock upset loss down there at 130 pounds, could one day move all the way up to junior middleweight and not only become a champion there, a unified Ring Magazine and lineal champion, all in the span of 12 months. 3 belts, 2 champions.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought? After the Obanov fight, the Harper draw, the Taylor loss, who would have thought that Natasha had it in her to take a leap of faith that broad that would pay off? Natasha Jonas is very much this year's Fighter of the Year in the women's category.
She took control of her career, decided to do things on her own terms, and it all paid off.
She didn't want to be used, didn't want to be treated like just some opponent anymore, and she established herself as one of the best and brightest fighters in this entire sport. Natasha Jonas very much is this year's Fighter of the Year in the women's category. In the men's category, the more obvious answer, the more obvious choice. This year's Fighter of the Year in the men's category is Dimitri Bivol.
I was surprised how many people were writing him off ahead of that Canelo Alvarez fight, that the bookies had him the betting underdog.
They should have priced that fight at least even money, the way he went in there and thoroughly dominated what was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter at that time.
Bivol's performance against Canelo Alvarez greatly altered people's perceptions of Canelo as a fighter, and Dimitri.
He put the whole world on notice with that fight, with that performance, but the buck didn't stop there. He faced a naturally bigger man than Canelo and a bigger man than himself in Zurdo Ramirez, who was far more acclimated to the light heavyweight division than Canelo Alvarez was. And Dimitri Bivol dominated him.
If you thought that he outclassed Canelo, look at what he did to Zurdo.
This year was the most successful year of Dimitri Bivol's entire career. A fighter, a champion, a skilled one, who for the most part before this year was flying largely under the radar. And just like that, in the year of 2022, he has arrived.
He is this year's recipient for Fighter of the Year in the men's category. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great year of boxing, some very memorable moments, memorable fights. A good night to you.
And I very much look forward to what the next year in this sport has to offer.
I am looking forward to doing it again, this time next year.
Happy holidays and Happy New Year's to you, boxing fans around the world.
Be safe and drink responsibly.